Okay. Um, Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. We are all wiping the tears away. So moved by the film and so thrilled that we could have you here today to join us. I thought it would be a good idea if we sort of went through the Zoom, and perhaps if you could each introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your connection to Sir Nicholas Winton. I'm going to start, Tamara, I'm going to start with you.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having us. And I want to give a shout out to Steve because it's very, very late in England and he's willing to join us at this very late hour. And so happy Kim is here too. And my connection to this film is that my mom was on a different kind of Kindertransport, on a Kindertransport from Germany. And I've been very interested in telling the narrative, this particular Holocaust narrative, for the last couple of decades, and really spreading the news about this narrative and letting people know about it. Because one of the things I heard when I first became involved with a group of an organization in this country that focuses on the Kindertransport is that the story really wasn't known very well. So I made it a point to make sure that that changed. And I've been very involved in spreading the word and also hosting a lot of second generation in this city and somewhat in other parts of the world, and England. And I'm just really, I'm really, really touched to be asked to speak about this film because Barbara was a really close friend of mine. We got to know one another. I guess, Steve, when did we meet? About, was it 7 or 8 years ago, something like that? And we just became, it was just one of those amazing friendships that started with a bang. And it was so bittersweet to see this film and knowing that Barbara didn't get to see the finished product. But that's really how I'm related. I've known Steve for as long as I've known Barbara, I guess 7 or 8 years, whenever we first met. And then Kim, we've known one another through your, I guess I got to know your mom before I got to know you about 20 years or so ago when I first helped put on a conference for Kindertransport survivors. And I've just always loved your mom and your sister and your brother as well. So, and I'm just so happy that we're all here. So,
Well, it's great. Thank you so much for your work and also for helping us bring the film to Birmingham for this early
my
screening.
pleasure.
Steve, thank you so much for staying up so late to join us here. It would be much easier if we were Birmingham and not Birmingham. Please tell us a little bit about you and perhaps a perspective for our audience on what kind of stories you heard within the family. How did your father-in-law speak about his experience, and when did you become aware?
Okay, hi. So I suppose I became aware a little bit before. 1988 was a pretty big year for us because 1988 was the year that Nikki was discovered, if you like, that That's Life program, and that's when the film is based. And Barbara and I were actually married in 1988, and we had our first child then as well. And the subject of the rescue was something that I knew about, and I'd known Barbara for quite a while before then. So it wasn't a family secret, but it simply wasn't talked about an awful lot. And Nicky was fairly quiet about it. He didn't have an awful lot to say unless someone sort of pushed him. And then, of course, once the story broke, he had to get in there and tell his side of the story, I suppose. But he was a very interesting man to meet. He was had a very sharp mind. He was a very relaxed kind of guy, but you had to get things right or you would get caught out pretty quickly. So he was a fascinating character to know. And it's wonderful for us to put out this message and to see this film going around the world. Literally, I've had letters and emails from all around the world, and it is absolutely marvelous to see that happening. And Nikki's approach to this was fantastic. I've been looking at, well, today, in fact, I got an email this morning from someone in France who said, I've just discovered my grandfather was one of Nikki's rescued children, and he flew into Croydon in 1939 in an aeroplane. So that was a fantastic discovery for us. So our website is always live, and we are always getting people coming from all over the world. But Nikki's message of compassion and care for those in need is really the message that's going around. That's what we're trying to put out, and that was the Nikki that we knew, always involved in some kind of wonderful charitable works. He was looking after these old people's homes, and he was quite incredible right up to the last few moments. In that sense, he was concerned and looking after other people.
Extraordinary. Kim, thank you so much for joining us. Can you tell us a little bit about your family history and the connection to
Yes, I think if you watch the film, you have the idea that people who lived in Prague got their children on the kinder transport. My mother and her two sisters lived in a very small village and quite remote from Prague in Czechoslovakia. And my grandparents had never, as far as we know, even been anywhere near Prague. It was 300 miles from Prague, which was a big journey. They had a simple kind of an existence in this village. My mother grew up, in a house. It wasn't like a shtetl. Some people envision that. It was a village with a town square and a church. And she grew up there was no running water in the house. There was no electricity. But she talks fondly about, she always talks about going into the woods and picking wild strawberries. She was the middle of three girls, Yoshi, Alice, and Ellie. And it's a kind of a miraculous thing that my grandmother, Sidonia, and grandfather, Solomon, heard about the kinder transport. I mean, I've been to this village, Tristana, and I don't know how you get out even without Hitler being involved. It's just so remote and out of the way. And her uncle, though, my mother's uncle, the girl's uncle, was stationed for this company in Berlin, a company in Czechoslovakia, and got a very up-close view of what was happening there, and was then transferred to London. And we're not sure how, but somehow that at that point connected with Nikki, and the uncle wrote to his sister saying, if you can't get out, at least get the children out. And a lot of people in the village thought they were crazy, to put their children. The youngest was 10, Ellie. There's a story about when my grandparents took them to the station to put them on the train. Ellie was 10. She was kind of a frail child. And my grandmother, the older two, Yoshi was just 15, turned 15, and my mother was just 14. And my grandmother put little Ellie on the train and then took her off and then put her back on and took her off. And my mother, who was very jealous of the younger sister, the baby, she and her sister were yelling, keep her. They didn't want to deal with it. But thankfully, my grandmother had the courage, actually, to put her youngest child, going to a country where they didn't know what awaited these children, and they didn't speak the language. I'm going to show you, hopefully you can see, this is a picture of my mother around that time, little village girl with braids. And then of course, that was the end. I'll just mention that the way this whole Nikki story came here, I was writing for the Washington Post. I'm a journalist, but that's when they had the first kinder transport reunion in London, 50 years after. And my mother and her sisters had no idea who rescued them. But I heard about this, that they were going to this thing. And I told my editor at the Post that this seemed like a great story. So she dragooned this guy who was on vacation in England and made him go. He wrote a story about it. And that that story in the Post inspired the Oscar-winning film Into the Arms of Strangers, because the filmmaker saw the story and the penny sort of dropped that her mother had been on a kinder transport, and this she decided to make that film. So it all sort of connects.
It's just so extraordinary, and I really thought that the filmmakers did such an excellent job of really portraying that sort of agonizing decision of taking the risk into the unknown with the hope of saving children versus the experience of separating. So I really felt exactly what you described as a viewer. Well, I know our audience has a number of questions. We have them from two different theaters. So I'm going to open it up, and then I have my own list of questions, but I'm sure, you know, we'll see who begins to. All right, we've got microphones circulating in the crowd. Let's open it up. Anybody who wishes to start with a question? Yes.
I'm just amazed that you could get Anthony Hopkins to be in this film. He really hasn't done any real films in the last 4 or 5 years, and to get him to be part of this fabulous movie, I'm just amazed. Is there a story behind?
So the question is all about Anthony, the story of getting Anthony Hopkins, who I thought was extraordinary in this. Our question is said they have not seen Anthony Hopkins in anything in a number of years. What's the backstory to casting him and getting him to agree?
I think the only one who would know is Steve, right?
Yeah, Steve knows.
Yeah, I can help you. I can help you a little bit with that. Yeah, well, certainly, it was Barbara's when the film was first mooted. Barbara was very definite that Anthony Hopkins was the man to play the part, and so she was rooting for him. And initially, he agreed to do it, but then I think COVID came along and he sort of went into the background. I think he backed off a bit. He was obviously concerned about traveling to Europe and the risk of COVID and so on. And it seemed that he was disappearing off the scene, which was kind of worrying. And we also had another director who went as well. But then came, I think, possibly the Ukraine war, the situation with the refugees began to increase and become more critical. And I think that he took that on board and decided that he really did want to take this part. So I think it was a personal decision from his that he wanted to make his own contribution. That's my understanding of it.
That is extraordinary. And after watching this film and hearing about your father-in-law and his mother, I don't put anything past any Winton anywhere to be able to make the impossible happen. Do we have a question from the other theater? Okay.
Were any of the children raised Jewish or consider themselves Jewish now?
Were any of the children who were rescued and placed in British homes, were they raised Jewish, and do they think of themselves as Jewish now? The sort of question that is posed by the rabbi in Prague, perhaps.
I think I can speak to that unless you'd like to, Kim. I think that we can all jump in, but that it really depended. A lot of the children were raised they were raised in Christian families. In fact, we have some kinder transport survivors who became Christian. We even have a priest. I met at one of the conferences, I think in London, the 60th anniversary, I met a priest who was on the kinder transport. A lot of the children who were on kinder transports never saw their parents again. They said goodbye to them at the train, boat, wherever, and that was the last they saw of one another, very sadly. It wasn't the case for all children, but it was certainly the case for most of the Czech children, because we had so few survivors in the Jewish community in Czechoslovakia. But in England, those who arrived in England, some of them did arrive and live with Jewish families. I know in my mother's case, she lived with a Christian family that had 8 kids. And at one point, someone in the Jewish community in another city found out about her and tried to get her to move and to live with a Jewish family. And she said, no, this is my new family. But so I think that's a really good question. I think we have some people like my mother who went back to Judaism later, some who didn't. I think that I don't have percentages, and I don't know if we have those statistics, but it's an excellent question.
That's great.
Kim, do you have? Yeah.
Sorry?
Do you have any additional information, Kim, about that?
Well, I know my mother and her sisters, much to their surprise, they thought they were going to go and stay with their uncle when they arrived in London, but they were actually sent to a children's home. It's been a thing in the family that he had a wife and a small child and didn't have that much money, but I think there was a lot of shock when they found that out. However, that children's home called Wyberley was a happy experience for them on balance. The one who had it the worst was Ellie, little Ellie. She was sort of farmed out here and there, and at one point fell in with a family that was it was a bad story. And my mother and hers, that all through, well, I guess my mother mostly, they had been brought up quite religiously in the village. So, you know, they were, I mean, her father was not any kind of Hasidic Jew, or he was just a guy, but, you know, he took his Judaism quite seriously. And my mother just sort of let it go, as, you know, on her own in London, and felt kind of, I think she feels a bit guilty about it. She's still around. She's going to be 99 in May. And,
Wow.
you know, my father was from Vienna and he was Jewish, but he was not brought up in a religious home, and he just wanted to do everything fun. So he'd get this little Christmas tree, and my mother could not. Every time it was just so hard for her. But my father was just like, it's just fun. We're doing it for fun. So it was a bit of a stressor on her. My aunt Yoji, on the other hand, was quite religious and stayed with it to a point. Not her father wouldn't have been satisfied, but she did it more than my mother or little Ellie.
So interesting. All right, another question from this theater, Ron. Oh, all right.
I know that at some point during the war, when Britain was being bombed, did they ship their children to the countryside?
So, yes.
How that affected the children that were in London to be safe, and then were they part of some of the transport out to the countryside? Or
So this is a question about England during the war, during the Blitz, the experience of the children in London who were sent out to the country to be safe from the bombing, and any memories or perspective on how this affected the children of the kinder transport.
My
Yeah,
mother was actually in London. She was
Mm.
getting a little older at that point, and she had to work, and she was in London, and talked about it with, you know, running into the shelter and just hoping that not to get killed.
I think the idea of taking the children out to the countryside did, you know, possibly aid the concept of bringing children in, because certainly the children from London were shipped out wholesale into sort of rural areas, or simply when whole schools were moved into rural areas. And I think that possibly it did sort of help with the mindset that children needed to be looked after and needed to be taken care of. And so possibly that did contribute to allowing more children into the country. I mean, it perhaps, you know, moved public opinion a little bit, but it wasn't always accepted. It wasn't always, you know, appreciated, people having their children told that they were going to be carted off to work for some farmer in the middle of the countryside. It didn't always work out very well, unfortunately.
I can completely understand that.
Yeah, I think my Aunt Ellie was used as a maid when she was just a little girl, really.
Yeah.
All right, if you speak, I'll relay it to the.
My father came out on the kinder transport from Germany. And my father and my Oma and my Opa, they never talked about it. And there were two schools of thought. Either you shared your story or you weren't able to. And I was wondering if before this all came out in 1988, 1989, were people able to talk about it, or was this a catalyst to help those who couldn't speak about it share their stories?
We have an audience member who
We could hear that, I think.
Okay.
Did we all hear it? Yeah.
Me,
Okay.
not well. If you could repeat it, that would be great.
Oh, he was
Oh.
asking what whether the people who were on the kinder transport talked about that in their families.
Right.
I was saying, in my case, no. My father had a much more heroic story in terms of, upbeat, kind of upbeat. He became part of a secret British commando unit and invaded Normandy. That's why my last name is Masters. He had to have a British identity. So he talked about the war in terms, the fighting, and he made it all sound, he didn't get into the gruesome parts when we were kids, but it was almost unwritten and unspoken that you don't ask about my mother's parents. And I once remember saying, where are my grandparents? And she said they died in concentration camp. And being a little kid, I remember thinking, camp is fun. How do you die? It didn't make no sense to me, but I didn't pursue. And then years later, my mother went to a Survivor event, and there was a young man there with his father. And the young man was very angry that this story of the Holocaust had been this oppressive weight in the house, but it was off limits. And my mother asked me if I felt that way. And I said, well, I don't think I'm so angry, but it was a little strange. And she said, how was I supposed to explain it to a child? Which is a really good point.
So I'm also the child of 2 Holocaust survivors, and in my family, there was kind of an unwritten rule that you just didn't ask questions. I didn't ask questions of my parents, and I was very aware that there was that there was something that could be gained from actually opening up that secret place, and I didn't know how to do it. But I did become very involved in planning in the Kinder Transport Association here in the United States, planning a conference, I think the one you're speaking about in Washington, D.C. And then I started a campaign. I actually kind of pushed to have the conference in Washington because they never had one in my city. And I thought, well, if we have a conference here, there'll be a lot of people that'll come out of the woodwork and find community here, perhaps. And maybe my parents will go. And my parents at first said, no, we're not interested in this. We don't want to go. We don't want to do this. But they did end up coming, and it changed everything. After that, I couldn't get them to stop talking.
Well, that's a version of that happened with us too. Yeah.
And
I read Exodus. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, because your mother is your mother is very much a part of this story too. I made it a point after becoming involved with the Kinder Transport board to really, as I mentioned before, get this story told. I just made it a mission. And so I put out a press release when we were having this conference here in Washington. And I've done this before. I'll get maybe 10, 15 responses. I got 45 responses from TV, radio, cable, print media, all over the world. I had Saudi Arabia television come. Everybody was interested in this story. And it was, had never had an experience like this before. My parents were there, and all of a sudden I was fielding calls and trying to get survivors to this TV station or that radio station, or put them on, as we were on the way to a TV station, handing them my phone so they could be interviewed by a radio station. It was really pretty. I've never had an experience like that again. But I got a call from one of the largest local TV stations, ABC News, and they said, we need a survivor who didn't see their parents again. Can you have someone here at the station in 15 minutes? So I went about asking people, you know, I'm introducing myself. I'm Tamara Meyer. I'm a second generation. I just wanted to ask you, did you see your parents again after you were, and you know, the first was, yes, I'm so happy I saw my mother. That's wonderful. And then the next person I went to was Alice Masters, Kim's mom. And I did the same thing. And she said, no, I never saw my parents again. And I said, great, can you come with me?
Nice.
I
Nice
probably
one.
didn't do it exactly like that. But and she looked at me and she said, no. It was the last thing she'd want to do. And I've known Alice now for 25 years, and she just loves to stand in front of people or sit in front of people and tell her story. And there's so much passion that she has to do this. And I think people really get a lot of fantastic messages from Kim's mom about resilience and about being able to survive and thrive after something so heinous happens to them, and so many more stories. Anyway, that's the story that connects that question for me to your mom in particular, Kim.
Yeah.
And then Steve, I was going to ask, I mean, we really get a sense in the film that Nicholas really, you know, remained committed to so much humanitarian work throughout his life. Did he speak about what was happening in the present, or did he refer back to his work in the past and the time that
Oh, well,
you...
he was very much a man in the present. I mean, absolutely. And yeah, I mean, remember that the time in Prague, he was there for 3 weeks, and then went on. Eventually, signed up, became an ambulance driver, and then later he became an instructor, a flight instructor for the RAF. And then after the war, he was involved in the transport of the gold and the loot and so on. He had to have that all converted back into currency. But then after the war, he came back, and well, he'd finished with the bank. I think he got pretty fed up with work with the bank pretty early on. So he went into
that didn't seem necessarily like the best fit, I have to say.
No, exactly. So he went on, but he retired fairly early, and then he just became involved in charitable work. And of course, he was very involved initially in MenCap. He was involved in the looking after there was a third son. There was Robin, who was the third son, who died very young, and so the family became involved with the idea of what we now call mental health and so on. So Nicky started on this career, if you like, of charitable work, and then having done what he could for his son, he then moved on to look after the older people. So these not exactly care homes, but sort of sheltered housing, and was a fantastic fundraiser. And there was Winton House, was his first home that he had built, and then the next one I think was called Nicholas House. So he was constantly on the go and constantly fundraising and charity raising. So yeah, and of course the funny story about the Samaritans, which is rather brilliant. That was always a great story that he used to tell. So yeah, he was a man of the moment, and he certainly believed that we shouldn't be looking back overly. We should be getting on and sorting out the issues that need to be seen to today. You know, responding to need. Very much so.
Well, that you answered one of my questions. I wanted to find out whether that Samaritan story was true. It seemed,
Yes.
you know, too good to be fiction. All right, we have a question here.
I'd like to know if Sir Nicholas's Jewish heritage played a role, a meaningful role in his life. Did he speak to that?
He was someone who really was not involved in any formalized religion. I would say he was baptized as a Christian while he was at school in his school days, And certainly he was not a man who would stop and get engaged in philosophical discussions. That really, he didn't kind of have time for that, I would say. So no, that wasn't my experience, that he looked into that heritage. I would say not, I'm afraid. But we do have his ring, and of course the ring, they couldn't give him the eye, they couldn't give him the award for the gentle, but they gave him his ring. There we are, and there's Nicky's ring. Save one life, save the world. So there you are, there you have it. It's all in the ring.
You know, when not long after this all became known, and Nicky came to my parents' house for dinner in Washington. And this was I think it's not like he wanted to keep the story of what he had done secret, but when it started to blow up, I think I think Steve, you'll back me up, it was a little unnerving. And my father said, well, you're a reporter and I want you to just ask him questions and get everything out. And I want to hear the whole thing. And I tried a couple of times, and it was really clear that he was not going to do it. And almost to the point where it would be rude to press him further. And my father got really mad at me. But at that time, and I think you see it in the film, I think the analysis was, first of all, he had lost a train full of children who were faces and names, not just ideas to him. And I think he just felt that he was getting more credit because he was alive, and the others you see in the film who were cut out in these earlier documentaries, which were not factual and accurate. He felt like, why was he getting so much credit when he was in London more than on the ground in Czechoslovakia? But I think he came to accept that role. And then years later, I went to see him in Maidenhead with my mother and my daughter, and we had lunch together, and he let me interview him for NPR, which is where I was working at that point, which you can find if you Google, NPR Nicholas Winton. So at that point, he had just reconciled himself. I think even if the parts of the story weren't accurate, people needed him to be, they needed a hero, but I think he'd be pleased to see that this film is more true, Steve. Wouldn't you think?
I think that's right. Yeah. I mean, he certainly wouldn't see himself as a hero, and we were always sort of fending off awards, and one of them, which I think we kind of regret, we had a call from one of the English universities saying we would like to give you an honorary degree. And we all sat there, what do we want with that? And he just threw his arms up, well, not particularly interested. So and I think that they'd also approached him to make the film some 15 years before they actually did. And he just said, oh, no, not interested. Why would you want to do that? So yeah, he was a very humble man in that respect, and very private man. He didn't want to be overexposed, certainly.
But you will hear him, if you listen to the NPR piece, say that the story had been transformed to the point where he couldn't recognize parts of it. And he had a saying, I don't know the Latin, Steve, but if it's not true, it makes a damn good story. He was very charming at that meeting, and my daughter was about 9, and she just thought he loved her, she loved him. It was a really nice occasion.
Well, I think we have to give way to this. There is a hero story and a hero formula, isn't there? And certainly it was tried to push him into that mold. And part of the reason that Barbara wrote the book was to put the records all straight, that this wasn't some incredible secret that was suddenly discovered. The family obviously knew what had happened. Greta, his wife, certainly knew. But so yes, I think you're right that he did go along. He did have to sort of relax into it and go with it to some degree. I think that's inevitable.
That's great. And Kim, I think we can send out the link to the story to the people here who are interested. We have another question.
Is it on? Okay. There's one question or one point that never came up, and I happen to know some people mutually, so I've known a lot about it. I was told and read in many places that the wife did not know a lot of the details, and much later in his
She
life,
knew.
personal little tidbits
She did know.
all the way through the movie were hidden in the attic. And she found that thing, the chest, and that is how she found out the story. But it never came up tonight, and I'm just too curious.
All right, were you able to hear the question?
I think this was about the story of Nikki's wife finding the scrapbook in the attic without knowing anything about it. And as you see in the film, I'm Steve, you should go ahead, just say it's not true.
I could, if I were to, I've got a big filing cabinet behind me, and if I were to sort of delve into that filing cabinet, I could come up with a piece of paper, a little document, which was Nikki's trial to become a councillor, a local Labour Party councillor. And he writes in his CV, this is in the middle part of the 1950s, and he writes that I rescued some 600 children during World War II, or the beginning of World War II. So certainly the people of Maidenhead were aware of it, and certainly Greta was. So Matthias's story, it's a great story. He's there in this huge attic full of cobwebs and oak beams, and she's crashing around and finds this dusty old box, and bangs the dust off it and says, "Oh, look at this." Well, Nikki's attic, I'm afraid, was about 3 feet high, and it was kind of modern because it was a Scandinavian house, and I know because I've crawled around inside it, So it's a great story, but no, of course they knew, and the children knew, and to say I probably knew the story actually in the late 70s, in fact.
Yeah, he told us that he had tried to get people to pay attention and they didn't. And I think he just gave up at a certain point, but the filmmaker, the documentarian is the one I think who cooked that up. And
Yes.
It's been sort of fallen into the public, a version of the story that is just fabricated.
Well, I like that fiction can deliver a little bit more truth, perhaps, in this case. So,
as a journalist, I like the truth.
I know the real truth. I'm with you too. I'm a documentary filmmaker, so I'm with you there. But in this case, the narrative adaptation gets us closer. I think we have another question. Bringing a mic around.
They're not working.
Oh, they're not working. Okay, project. Yes.
I have a question. His mother seemed to be very into the entire saving of his children. And how long did she live afterwards, and how much more did she participate than was shown in the film?
Yes, this is a question centering on Nicholas's mother, who, is just an extraordinary force within the film. And so we have a question about the nature of her involvement. How long did she live after this period? And, what else should we know about her that wasn't portrayed on screen?
Gosh. Well, I have to say that yes, I didn't know her. I think she must have died without looking it up in the 70s. I suspect. She was a strong character. When she was spoken of, the phrase most often used was "doesn't suffer fools gladly." So she obviously was Nikki's. Well, you could say that perhaps he was her favorite. I mean, there were the 3 children, and that perhaps she seemed to get on particularly well with Nikki, I suspect. And he obviously, got her on the case straight away. He was writing all his letters, wrote us back to his mother, and she got into action, sorting out the visas and so on. So her character, obviously a strong character and very intelligent. Oh, and of course, in the book, they talk about the matriculation, don't they? She was the first German school child to actually matriculate, to qualify for a university. The German word escapes me for the moment. So she's highly educated and probably a little bit frustrated. So one gets the impression that maybe given this challenge that it was a great thing for her to get stuck into and get involved in. She was probably under-resourced, shall we say. Yeah, interesting question.
Gosh, really vivid to see, and certainly having Helena Bonham Carter play anybody, can really do a lot, but just a force to be reckoned with.
I have her portrait on my landing, and so every time I walk down my corridor upstairs, I come face to face with her, I'm afraid.
Yes.
So I had not heard the story of the Burnhams, so I wanted to confirm that that was in fact true and not embellishment. And were both Sir Nicholas's parents Jewish, and both decided together when they came to England to give up Judaism?
So this is a question about Sir Nicholas's parents, changing their name from Wertheim and converting, giving up their Judaism. Do you know some of the backstory about some of their decision making?
Well, the name changing, this is to do with social pressures in England. This is to do with a country at war and finding that your neighbours don't want to speak to you, not because your name is Jewish, but because your name is German. And so they changed the name once during World War II, and then I believe they changed it back again. And then the story was that if the threat of war, they was considering changing the name again before the outbreak of World War II. So the story was that if war was going to be declared, that they wouldn't change their name. And so when the Prime Minister came back and waved his piece of paper saying peace in their time, they took that as a sign that there weren't going to be hostilities, and therefore they did change their name. It sounds kind of contradictory, but that was what happened. And then, of course, it all changed anyway. But so yeah, it was to do with social pressures. I wouldn't say it was to do with the faith. I wouldn't say so.
Okay, well, I would like to extend just an absolute incredible thanks, Michele Forman, UAB Director.
If you would let me, can you hear me? You can't hear me.
Tamara, Steve, Kim, we cannot thank you all enough for being with us tonight. Thanks all of you for coming and joining us. And we hope that there was something from this film that you can take with you and remember. Oh, is there something? What's that? Oh, Kim, were you saying something?
Yeah, if I could just take a moment, I want to read part of a letter that my grandmother wrote to her children when they were in England, and just as an ending note. And this was in 1940, Passover evening. Seder evening was lovely once upon a time when everyone was seated around the table. Father always at the head, and on either side, I, your mother, and you, my children, eyes shining with happiness. Life was beautiful. That's how it was before, and that's how it was last year. But this year you are not here. Fate has forced us to send you to a foreign land. Thank God your letters bring us good tidings, but your empty seats embrace us with their emptiness. Another Seder came, we sit down around the table. There are only a few of us, father, mother, and also your old granny, whom fate forced from her home, her familiar place, her children scattered helter-skelter. Cruel fate touched us all. A great distance separates us. We think of you, and you, dear children, think of us at the same moment. We know that we are linked in thought and prayer. In our hearts, the firm belief that the time will come when we will see each other again. It will be like before, but a little different. For you will have grown up, and we, awaiting this precious moment, will have aged.